The story of the National Football League does not begin with private jets, state-of-the-art stadiums, or multi-million-dollar contracts. It begins with a bus. Not the sleek, air-conditioned coaches that carry teams today, but a different kind of machine. Drafty, rattling, unforgiving. A bus that doubled as a prison for the men who climbed aboard it. The road was their first opponent, and in the early days of professional football, it was the one that often did the most damage. Picture a November night in the late 1920s. A group of battered players, most of them barely out of their 20s, climb onto a bus after playing in front of a few thousand fans in a steel town. Their bodies are covered in mud, their fingers taped with whatever cloth could be found, their ribs aching from the collisions that define their sport. They are not headed home. Home is far away. Instead, they face a ride of nearly 20 hours, straight through the night, toward another small city where another game awaits. They know they will step off that bus and onto another field with no time to rest, no chance to recover. For this, they will be handed $25, sometimes less. It is here, in the dark silence of those endless miles, that the truth of early professional football is revealed. Newspapers of the era celebrated these men as iron-willed warriors. Crowds cheered their toughness. Owners spoke of grit and tradition. But the players knew better. Behind the myth was exhaustion. Behind the applause was poverty. Behind every cheer was the sound of an engine grinding through the night, while men who could barely move sat upright, praying the bus did not break down before the next town. I have studied the ledgers of early franchises. They tell a story that is both simple and tragic. A paycheck for a game in 1925, $25, sometimes $30. For a star player, maybe $50. But when you deduct meals, lodging, and the price of simply existing on the road, the paycheck shrinks into nothing. Many players ended their seasons owing more money than they earned. And yet, they kept climbing aboard those buses, because the alternative was unemployment, hunger, or life in a factory that paid even less. The road punished them in ways that the game itself could not. Broken ribs throbbed with each bump of the suspension. Concussions worsened under the vibration of wooden seats. Sleep came in fragments, 20 minutes here, half an hour there as players leaned against fogged windows, shivering in the cold. There were no team doctors to monitor their health, no athletic trainers to tape their injuries, only teammates sharing whispers in the dark, wondering if the game they loved would ever be worth what it was taking from them. Sometimes the bus failed them entirely. Engines overheated, tires blew, roads turned to mud after rainstorms. Players pushed buses out of ditches, their bodies already broken from the collisions of the previous day. I've read stories of teams stranded in small towns, begging for rides from passing motorists, splitting up just to reach the next city in time for kickoff. Professional athletes reduced to hitchhikers, their dignity stolen by the very league that demanded their sacrifice. The Great Depression made everything worse. Owners cut costs wherever possible. Teams stayed in the cheapest boarding houses, often sleeping 3-2 a bed. Meals were little more than bread, soup, and coffee, if they could afford it. Black players, though few in number before the league's unofficial ban in 1933, faced an even harsher road. Segregated hotels refused them. Segregated restaurants denied them. While their white teammates endured misery, they endured humiliation on top of it. For them, the bus ride was not just long, it was isolating. A reminder that America's cruelty followed them everywhere. There was little glamour and even less stability. Teams folded overnight, leaving players stranded mid-season with no paycheck and no way home. Some men carried everything they owned in a single bag: cleats, a change of clothes, and a few dollars. When the team disbanded, the bag was all they had left. Others took jobs in towns along the way, working in factories during the week and playing on Sunday just to cover travel costs. Professional football was less a career than a gambola bet placed on survival in a country that offered no guarantees. And yet, the mythology of toughness grew out of these rides. The public never saw the misery. They saw men who played through pain, men who traveled great distances for the love of the game. They saw warriors, but the truth is darker. Many players were broken long before the opening kickoff. The long hours on the road drained them, body and soul. By the time they reached the field, they were already defeated. As one former player said decades later, "The road beat you worse than the game ever did." That is the hidden story of the NFL's birth. Not the touchdowns, not the trophies, but the miles. Thousands of miles logged in buses that rattled like cages, carrying men who sacrificed everything for scraps. 20 hours at a time. It's $25 at the end of it. This was professional football before the bright lights. This was the foundation upon which the modern NFL empire was built. Think of the contrast. Today's players step onto chartered planes, recline in leather seats, and arrive at five-star hotels. Their meals are prepared by chefs, their recovery monitored by medical staff. But those luxuries exist because of the men who came before men who accepted 20 hours of misery for the chance to keep the game alive. Men whose sweat and blood were traded for gas money. Men who built the road the league now travels in comfort. There is no way to measure what was lost on those journeys. Marriages strained and collapsed under the weight of absence. Injuries worsened into lifelong disabilities. Dreams of glory dissolved into silence, as men too broken to continue slipped quietly out of the game, forgotten by the league they helped sustain. We remember the champions, the teams that survived, but not the miles that destroyed so many along the way. This is the dark side of football. A league that celebrated toughness while quietly consuming the men who embodied it. A league that asked them to endure not only the brutality of the game, but the greater brutality of the road. And it is this hidden cost, the endless miles, the sleepless nights, the hunger. It's the humiliation that we must confront if we are to understand how the NFL truly began. So we begin here, not on the field, but on the bus. The year is 1928. The night is cold, and the road stretches endlessly into the dark. A group of men sit in silence. Their bodies broken, their paychecks already spent, their dreams hanging by a thread. The engine growls, the windows shake, and the bus lurches forward into another 20 hours of suffering. This is the untold story of professional football's traveling nightmare. The story of professional football in the 1920s and 1930s often gets told through the lens of grit and glory. The leather helmets, the dirt fields, the iron-willed men who paved the way for the modern spectacle of the NFL. But to understand the game, you have to understand journeys that shaped it. The endless miles between towns. The cramped seats of buses that groaned along cracked highways, the unrelenting exhaustion that became the unspoken tax of chasing a dream. This was not a league of privilege. It was a league stitched together by desperation and improvisation, by men willing to endure unimaginable hardship for the chance to keep playing. When we think of the NFL today, we think of private jets, chartered planes, and luxury buses wrapped in team logos. But in its infancy, there was nothing glamorous about getting from one city to the next. Teams traveled not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to survive. The NFL wasn't a national powerhouse in those years. It was a fragile experiment, a loose collection of franchises struggling to keep their doors open. To make money, you had to play. And to play, you had to travel, no matter what it cost you physically or financially. Travel was the invisible opponent. It wasn't listed on the schedule. It didn't appear in the standings, but it was there, looming over every week. Players would spend more hours on the road than they did on the field. They'd ride all day, sometimes through the night, only to step off a bus and play against another group of men who were just as battered and sleep-deprived. The league didn't build itself on well-planned logistics. It built itself on endurance. The roads themselves were part of the punishment. before the interstate highway system transformed American travel. Most journeys took place on narrow, winding two-lane roads, pitted with potholes and riddled with sharp turns that slowed progress to a crawl. A trip that might take 2 hours today could stretch to 10 in the 1920s. Teams piled into buses with little ventilation, wooden bench seating, and shocks that rattled your bones with every mile. There were no air-conditioned coaches or ergonomic cushions. Just men, packed shoulder to shoulder, equipment bags wedged between their legs, heads bouncing against the glass when the driver hit a bump. And then there was the money. The men on those buses weren't millionaires. They weren't even middle class in most cases. A typical paycheck for an NFL player in the 1920s might be $25 for a game, sometimes less, sometimes a little more if you were a star. Imagine sitting through 20 hours of bus travel, your body aching, your stomach empty, knowing that at the end of it all, you might clear barely enough to cover rent. That was the reality. One player, reflecting years later, described it bluntly. We weren't playing for money. We were playing to keep the game alive. The endurance wasn't just physical, it was mental. Every man on that bus knew that injury or exhaustion could end his career instantly. There were no long-term contracts, no guaranteed salaries, no unions to fight for better conditions. If you couldn't perform, you were replaced. Simple as that. And yet they kept climbing aboard those buses week after week because the alternative was worse. Giving up the game they loved. In many ways, the travel exposed the stark divide between the dream of professional football and the harsh economics behind it. The owners made promises they couldn't always keep. Teams were constantly folding, relocating, or merging to stay afloat. Schedules shifted on the fly, with opponents added or canceled at the last minute. That meant more travel, more improvisation, more hardship piled onto already fragile lives. Sometimes a player would get word of a game only a day or two in advance, leaving no time for rest or preparation. You just showed up, climbed aboard, and went wherever the league needed you. And yet, amid the misery, there was something binding about those journeys. On those buses, players forged bonds that went deeper than the game itself. They shared stories, cigarettes, and silence. They sang songs to pass the time, told jokes to distract themselves from the endless miles. Some even used the time to study plays, scribbling notes on scraps of paper, trying to prepare while their heads bobbed with every jolt of the road. Travel was suffering, but it was also community. Still, the costs were undeniable. Long rides meant stiff joints, cramped muscles, and bodies unprepared for the violence of the gridiron. Imagine stepping off a 20-hour bus ride and immediately suiting up to hit another man at full speed. Imagine doing it with no athletic trainers, no physical therapy, no modern medicine to patch you back together. A sprained ankle wasn't treated with ice baths and rehab sessions. It was wrapped in tape and ignored. Headaches weren't diagnosed as concussions. They were shrugged off as part of the game. The suffering of travel also revealed the fragility of the NFL's early years. In many cases, games were scheduled not for competitive balance, but for survival. A team might travel across several states for a single matchup, because the gate money from that game could be the difference between financial ruin and another week of existence. Travel dictated the shape of the league, carving paths not by geography or rivalry, but by necessity. That meant more buses, more miles, and more men pushed to the breaking point. In the middle of all this were the players themselves, men who, decades later, would be remembered as pioneers. But at the time, they weren't seen that way. They were expendable, anonymous, easily replaced. No one outside their teammates knew what they endured. No one outside those buses could imagine the toll of chasing football from town to town. And perhaps that's what makes their story so haunting. The modern NFL was built on their endurance, but their names rarely appear in the record books. The introduction to this journey isn't about glorifying suffering. It's about pulling back the curtain on a hidden truth, that the early NFL wasn't just brutal on the field. It was brutal off of it. The game we celebrate today as America's pastime grew out of a system that demanded sacrifice without reward, loyalty without guarantees, and endurance without recognition. Travel was the crucible. It tested not only the strength of their bodies, but the limits of their resolve. In the chapters ahead, we'll follow those buses. We'll ride the long, punishing roads of the 1920s and 1930s. We'll hear the echoes of men whose stories were buried beneath the glamour of modern football. And we'll come to see that the nightmare of travel was on T just a backdrop. It was the battlefield where the future of the league was fought. This is not the NFL, you know. This is the NFL as it was. Fragile, unforgiving, and fueled by the quiet desperation of men who endured 20 hours on a bus for $25, believing somehow it was worth it. The first thing you need to understand about travel in the early NFL is that it wasn't simply transportation. It was punishment. The bus ride was its own opponent, one that didn't tackle you head-on, but wore you down inch by inch, mile by mile, until you staggered into the stadium already beaten before the game even began. I've spoken with historians who specialize in this period, and they all circle back to the same truth. Before you even put on your helmet, before you touched a football, the road itself had already exacted its toll. These weren't sleek, comfortable motor coaches gliding down the interstate. They were rickety, converted school buses or rental coaches with hard wooden bench seats. No shock absorption, no ventilation in the summer, and no heating worth a damn in the winter. When you piled 20 or 30 men into that rolling box of metal, the air quickly turned sour with sweat, tobacco, smoke, and the sour tang of unwashed uniforms stuffed into canvas bags. The miles were endless, and the conditions only magnified the strain. Imagine sitting for 20 hours while the frame of the bus rattled beneath you like a loose wagon. Every bump jolted through your spine. Every pothole felt like a body shot. The roads weren't paved across large swaths of the country in the 1920s and 30s. Many were just dirt tracks kicked up into clouds of dust in summer, or frozen into jagged ridges in winter. If you were lucky, you got gravel. If you weren't, you felt every rut until your teeth chattered in your skull. One former player, recalling a ride from Ohio to Illinois in the late 1920s, said, "By the time we got there, half the team couldn't stand straight. Our legs were stiff as boards. You'd stretch, but the ache never left you. And then we had to play." That was the reality. The body doesn't simply snap back from that kind of abuse. When you've sat cramped for half a day or more, circulation slows, muscles tighten, joints swell. And yet these men were expected to walk into a stadium, strap on a leather helmet, and collide headlong with other human beings at full speed. Medical science has a term for this now: delayed onset, muscle fatigue, circulation damage, deep vein exhaustion. But back then, it was just called toughness. No trainer iced your joints after a 20-hour ride. No one handed you electrolytes or compression sleeves. You dragged yourself onto the field and did your best, even though your best was compromised before the first whistle. The irony was brutal. The very act of traveling to keep the league alive made the players weaker, less prepared, and more vulnerable to injury. Yet no one stopped to think about that. Owners booked games wherever money could be scraped together. Geography be damned. If the gate in Green Bay promised $300 more than the gate in Dayton, you packed your bags for Wisconsin, even if it meant losing 2 days on the road. The players' bodies became collateral damage in the business of survival. It wasn't only the physical toll, the psychological weight of those journeys was enormous. When you climb aboard a bus, knowing that every bump, every mile, is a step closer to exhaustion, it gnaws at you. You don't rest. You don't recover. Sleep came in brief, restless patches, if at all. The seats didn't recline. You couldn't stretch out. You nodded off only to be jarred awake by another jolt, another pothole. And in those long hours of semi-wakefulness, the doubts crept in. Was this worth it? Was $25 really worth the pain? For many men, the answer was complicated. Football wasn't simply a paycheck. It was pride. It was the last tether to a dream most people abandoned after college. And so you endured the misery. You told yourself it was part of the sacrifice, part of what separated the men willing to suffer from those who walked away. That mental calculus, that suffering meant legitimacy, became woven into the culture of the early NFL. Travel was not just endured, it was valorized. The men who lasted were the men who could take it. But make no mistake, the costs were real. A 1930s study of industrial laborers noted how long stretches of cramped, punishing travel increased rates of joint deterioration and circulatory problems. Now, imagine coupling that with the physical violence of football itself. You had players in their 20s moving like men twice their age. Knees stiffened, backs locked up, and shoulders refused to rotate. Some men would hobble off a bus already taped up, already limping, and yet they were expected to suit up and collide as if nothing was wrong. And here's another layer. The travel conditions didn't just punish the body. They shaped the style of play. Teams often started sluggish because their legs weren't under them. The first quarter became a war of attrition, not because of tactics, but because men were still shaking off the cobwebs of the road. That lethargy fed into the reputation of early pro football as slow or plodding compared to the college game. But if you'd seen those bus rides, you'd understand why. It wasn't a lack of talent, it was the toll of survival. There's an image that sticks in my head, pieced together from diaries and recollections. A player standing outside the bus at dawn, stretching against the cold, his breath fogging in the air. His legs tremble when he bends at the waist. He knows in 2 hours he'll be smashing into someone at full force. But at that moment, he can barely touch his toes. His paycheck depends on his performance, but the journey has already stolen half of his strength. That quiet battle between what the body could endure and what the game demanded was repeated countless times. Across the early NFL, the economics made it unavoidable. The league didn't have centralized funding. Owners pinched pennies wherever possible. If the cheapest option was a second-hand bus with bad suspension, that's what you got. If the schedule forced you to string together 3 games in 9 days, you did it. Players had no say. They were employees without bargaining power, at the mercy of budgets and backroom deals. And yet, for all the misery, there were glimmers of resilience. Some players developed routines to cope. They wrapped rags around their knees, massaged each other's backs, and took turns leaning against one another to nap. They laughed to distract themselves, sang songs in harmony, or told tall tales until the bus was filled with raucous noise. That noise wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. If you could laugh, if you could joke, you could endure. Still, even those rituals couldn't erase the fact that every mile cut into their careers. Injuries accumulated not just from hits, but from the grinding wear of travel. Ankles swelled, tendons tightened, and backs stiffened until retirement came early. Not by choice, but by necessity. The league lost countless players to the road as much as to the field. Their names are forgotten now, lost to the shadows of history, but their sacrifices laid the groundwork for what the NFL would eventually become. When I reflect on this first truth of the early NFL, I see a contradiction at its heart. The league marketed toughness, resilience, and grit, but much of that toughness was a byproduct of neglect. Players weren't glorified gladiators so much as disposable labor, ground down by travel conditions no modern athlete would tolerate. The very thing we now admire as the foundation of professional football was, in many cases, nothing more than survival under cruelty. And that's why, when we talk about the nightmare of travel, we can't reduce it to an inconvenience. It was a central character in the drama of early football. The buses were as much a part of the league as the ball itself. They shaped the men, the style of play, and the very survival of the sport. Without those miles, punishing, endless, and merciless, There would be no NFL, but the price was staggering, and it was paid quietly. In the stiff joints and shortened careers of men who believed $25 was worth 20 hours on a bus. No owner in the early NFL wanted to send his players across state lines for 20 hours of punishment. No coach wanted his team stiff, sore, and depleted before kickoff. But they had no choice. The economics of survival demanded it. The NFL in its infancy was a fragile thing. In the 1920s, there was no national television contract, no billion-dollar sponsors, no merchandising empire. Gate receipts were the only revenue stream. If enough paying customers didn't show up, there was no profit. Sometimes not even enough to cover the cost of the officials or the band. That meant owners were constantly chasing the next town, the next payday, the next crowd that might fill the bleachers and keep the lights on a little longer. Consider the schedules of those early years. In 1925, the Pottsville Maroons played 12 games in 2 months, stretching from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Illinois. The Duluth Eskimos in 1926 essentially lived on the road, playing 29 games in 20 different cities. They weren't just a football team. They were a traveling carnival, rolling into town, playing their hearts out, and then disappearing into the night. The Eskimos became known as the Iron Men, but the iron was in their helmets. It was in their willingness to endure the grind for meager wages. Why was this necessary? Because the markets were unstable. A small industrial town might support a team for 1 game, maybe 2, before the novelty wore off and attendance plummeted. So owners stacked road games, sometimes scheduling 3 in 8 days, believing volume could compensate for volatility. If the gate in Akron drew 1,000 fans, but the gate in Milwaukee drew 3,500, the travel between them seemed worth the suffering. To the men balancing ledgers, numbers on paper mattered more than muscles aching in silence. And here's the cruelest part. The players never saw much of that money. An average payday in the 1920s was between $25 and $75, depending on the team and the crowd. One week, you might pocket enough to cover rent. The next, after expenses, you might earn nothing at all. Owners had wide discretion to withhold pay or slash wages if the gate disappointed. And the players had no union, no contract security, no recourse. You didn't complain, because if you did, you were replaced. The traveling schedule became both a financial strategy and a form of control. By keeping players constantly moving, constantly dependent on the next payday, owners ensured loyalty, or at least silence. You couldn't plot rebellion or demand better treatment when you were exhausted, broke, and hundreds of miles from home. The road became a leash, binding men to the sport they loved, but also the system that exploited them. Historians of the period often compare the early NFL to barnstorming baseball teams or traveling vaudeville acts. And in many ways, the comparison is apt. Like vaudeville, pro football wasn't yet a fixed institution. It was itinerant entertainment, selling toughness and spectacle to any town willing to buy a ticket. The only way to spread the gospel of the professional game was to hit the road, over and over again, until word of mouth slowly built a following. But that missionary work came at a heavy cost. The Duluth Eskimos' 1926 season is the most famous example, but hardly the only one. That year, they logged over 10,000 miles on the road, often in freezing conditions, playing against rested opponents who hadn't traveled nearly as far. They finished with more losses than wins, but their endurance cemented a legend that outlived the franchise itself. By 1927, Duluth was gone. The Eskimos folded, leaving behind a story, but no team. This pattern repeated across the league. Teams sprang up, traveled aggressively to chase revenue, and then vanished within a year or two under the strain. Of the 14 original franchises in 1920, only to the Decatur Staleys, who became the Chicago Bears, and the Akron Pros later absorbed into other entities, had any lasting impact. The rest were swallowed by the economic vortex of small gates, high travel costs, and exhausted players. And yet, out of that instability, something important was forged. The act of traveling itself created shared mythology. Newspapers across the Midwest carried reports of these rugged men arriving after sleepless nights on the road. Bruised but unbroken, willing to fight again for the honor of their town. That narrative, the weary but unyielding traveler, became part of professional football's DNA. It painted the players as warriors, not workers, and in doing so, disguised the exploitation behind a veil of romance. One can see this duality in the language of the time. Owners bragged about their team's toughness on the road, calling them Ironmen, road warriors, leather giants. The headlines celebrated endurance, while the players quietly counted their meager pay. What looked like glory to the public often felt like desperation to the men living it. Let's put this into perspective. 20 hours on a bus for $25. That was a reality in the 1920s. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $400 today. Imagine being paid $400 to spend 20 hours jammed into a hard wooden seat. Then immediately throwing yourself into a violent collision sport with no padding to speak of, no health insurance, and no guaranteed salary. That was professional football in its infancy. A league of men surviving on crumbs, sacrificing their bodies so that the game might one day stand on sturdier ground. The economics weren't just cruel. They were unsustainable. Owners constantly folded or sold franchises because the balance sheet never added up. The traveling nightmare became a death spiral. More miles meant more wear, more injuries, more losses, which in turn meant fewer fans, less revenue, and eventually collapse. The only teams that survived were those with deep-pocketed backers or a loyal urban base large enough to sustain them without endless barnstorming. This is why the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers endured while the Duluth Eskimos and Rock Island Independents disappeared. Chicago and Green Bay could anchor themselves in local support. Duluth could not. The traveling model might generate temporary income, but it drained the players and hollowed out franchises until nothing remained. Still, for the men who lived it, those years carried a strange pride. Years later, veterans of the traveling team spoke of the misery with a kind of grim affection. They knew they had endured something few others could. They had been part of the crucible that hardened the NFL into a permanent institution. The road broke many, but those it didn't break carried its scars like medals. And that is the paradox of the NFL's early traveling nightmare. It was both the engine that kept the league alive and the poison that nearly killed it. It created legends, but destroyed livelihoods. It spread the game, but consumed the men. Without those endless miles, there might be no NFL. But because of them, countless players paid with their bodies and their futures for a league that would not reward them. This is the dark irony we must never forget. The foundation of America's most profitable sport was laid not in gleaming stadiums or on pristine fields, but in the cramped, suffocating cabins of buses grinding across frozen highways. The sweat, the soreness, the poverty, the sleepless nights, all of it went into the DNA of the league. The economics demanded it. The owners orchestrated it, and the players, with no choice, endured it. Travel was never just an inconvenience in the early years of professional football. It was an accelerant, a force that amplified every weakness, every vulnerability in a player's body until it became something larger, something permanent. The game itself was violent enough, but the constant miles layered another kind of punishment on top of the collisions. A hidden injury not delivered by an opponent's shoulder or helmet, but by the road itself. Consider what happens to a body already battered from 60 minutes of collisions, only to climb aboard a bus that rattled across frozen highways for 20 hours. Muscles torn on Sunday had no chance to heal by Friday, when another game awaited. Blood pooled in swollen joints. Backs tightened against unyielding wooden seats. Ankles that needed rest were forced to stiffen in the same cramped position for hundreds of miles. By the time the players reached their next destination, the damage was compounded. The road didn't just prevent recovery, it deepened the wounds. Sports medicine in the 1920s and 30s was still in its infancy. Trainers were often former players themselves, men with buckets of liniment and rolls of adhesive tape. The philosophy was simple. If you could stand, you could play. But travel made even minor sprains and bruises catastrophic. A twisted knee from one game became chronic after 2,000 miles of bus vibration. A sore shoulder that might have healed with rest instead froze, its ligaments tightening into long-term restriction. The numbers, where they exist, tell a sobering story. In 1929, the NFL roster limit was 30 players. By season's end, most teams had fewer than 20 healthy enough to take the field. Many men lasted only a season or two before their bodies gave out. The average career length hovered around 3 years, and travel was one of the primary reasons why. What today might be a 2-week recovery with modern rehab became a career-ending condition after endless rides through the Midwest. There's an account from a lineman who played for the Portsmouth Spartans, the small-town Ohio team that later became the Detroit Lions. He recalled injuring his ankle in a game against Chicago. The swelling was bad, but the team had no money to bench him. The very next morning, they boarded a bus for another contest 2 states away. He sat with his leg propped awkwardly on the seat in front of him, the vibration and cramped space turning the ankle into a balloon. By the time they arrived, his foot was black and blue. He played anyway. 2 weeks later, he was released. His career was finished. That story wasn't an exception. It was the rule. Travel transformed ordinary injuries into lifelong conditions. Former players spoke of arthritis setting in before they turned 30, of knees so stiff they needed canes within a decade of leaving the field. Modern audiences might assume the hits caused that damage, and they did, in part. But the road ensured those injuries never healed. It stole from men the possibility of recovery, accelerating decline until retirement was unavoidable. And then there was the mental toll. Imagine being a young man, once celebrated in college, now sleeping upright on a bus as it lurched through the night. You couldn't call home. You couldn't video chat or check messages. Letters, if you sent them, might take weeks to arrive. You were isolated from your family, from your community, from anything resembling stability. The road was not just physical exile. It was psychological exile. Loneliness ate at these men. Some coped by drinking. Others by gambling on card games that lasted the length of the ride. Some simply stared out the window, watching the endless miles of farmland roll by, wondering how long they could last before the weight broke them. For many, this was the first time they understood what professional football truly meant. Not fame. Not glory, but endurance in the shadows, with no promise of reward. The toll on relationships was brutal. Wives and girlfriends grew weary of the distance, of men who returned home limping, broke, and emotionally spent. Children often knew their fathers more as brief visitors than as stable presences. The constant travel turned football into not just a job, but a wedge driven between family and stability. One former Eskimos player wrote in a letter decades later, "We weren't a team. We were a band of travelers. You didn't think about the next season or even the next month. You just thought about making it to the next town, collecting your pay, and hoping your body held up long enough to keep going." His words capture the essence of that era. Football was not a career, but a journey through exhaustion with survival as the only prize. The mental strain was compounded by the knowledge that failure meant oblivion. There were no pension plans, no safety nets, no fallback. If you broke down, you were discarded. The league didn't remember you. The papers didn't write about you. You went home, back to the mills, the mines, the factories, with nothing to show but scars and memories. The road wasn't just punishing. It was indifferent. It swallowed men whole and moved on without pause. And yet, within that suffering, a strange kind of brotherhood formed. Players leaned on each other in the darkness of those rides. They shared food when one man was short on cash. They massaged each other's swollen joints. They sang songs, swapped stories, and found laughter where they could. It was a fragile bond, born not of glory but of shared misery. That bond often outlasted the league itself. Decades later, when men gathered at reunions, they didn't talk only about touchdowns or victories. They talked about the miles, about the buses, about the shared agony that no one else could ever fully understand. From the outside, fans saw grit and toughness. They saw men who seemed unbreakable, willing to travel any distance for the love of the game. What they didn't see was the cost. The careers cut short, the families left behind, the players discarded in silence. The traveling nightmare wasn't a side note in the story of early football. It was the central antagonist. It shaped every season, every roster, every decision. It created legends by destroying bodies. It built the league by breaking the men who played in it. That is the hidden truth of those years. The NFL survived because men endured the road. But the road left scars deeper than any hit on the field. Scars that never healed, that haunted them long after the final whistle blew. The body has its own memory. Long after the games ended, long after the roar of the crowd was replaced by silence, the aches and fractures of those early years lived on. And for the men who carved their careers in the shadows of bus stations and country roads, the journey itself was often the most punishing blow. Picture it. A lineman, 6'3", 240 pounds, wedged into a bus seat meant for a teenager. His knees locked against the metal bar in front of him. His shoulders pressed into the glass window. The seat springs, already worn to the wire, grind into his hip. He's been hit 100 times that week in practice, and on Sunday, he'll be hit 100 more. But right now, it's the simple act of sitting that threatens to break him. Hours roll by. Then, more hours. A trip that begins at dusk, bleeds into dawn, then stretches into the following day. 20 hours on the road, $25 in his pocket, and no thought of recovery beyond surviving the ride. Science tells us what happens when the body is left motionless that long. Blood flow slows, muscles stiffen. The same quadriceps and calves needed to push through a tackle become locked, starved of oxygen. For men already battered by games played on rock-hard fields, the stillness became a second form of violence. Ankles swelled. Backs flared with pain. Knees that had absorbed 1,000 hits during games now throbbed from nothing more than immobility. What should have been a chance to rest became another form of punishment. A former player from the 1930s once admitted in an interview, "You'd get off the bus and you couldn't walk straight. Sometimes I'd line up for the first snap and my legs felt like wood." That wasn't exaggeration. Hours of vibration from worn bus engines tightened every joint. Even the youngest men walked onto fields looking twice their age. They weren't just competing against opponents. They were battling the toll of transportation itself. The cruelest irony was that these players already played in the most dangerous era of football. Helmets were little more than thin leather caps. Pads were scraps of fabric and cotton. Concussions were dismissed as getting your bell rung. Bones cracked, ribs snapped, teeth shattered. And yet, rather than recovering with ice baths, team trainers, or proper sleep, they spent their nights bent like pretzels on second-hand buses. Every injury that might have healed was inflamed again by steel shocks and sleepless nights. There are recorded accounts of players icing their knees with nothing but melted ice from soda coolers at roadside diners. Others wrapped towels around their shoulders just to keep warm when buses rattled through winter mountains with broken heaters. For a generation of athletes, physical maintenance wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about endurance, survival. And that survival came at a devastating cost later in life. The damage was cumulative. Hours of poor circulation hardened arteries. Repeated swelling from cramped travel led to chronic joint inflammation. Those same knees that once bent beneath the weight of a game-winning drive stiffened permanently. Hips eroded. Spines curved. Men in their 40s limped like they were in their 70s. Doctors later confirmed what players already knew. Years of punishing travel left them with arthritis so advanced that prosthetic replacements were the only option. But in those years, few thought about the long-term price. The culture of football was one of grit, not comfort. You didn't complain about travel. You didn't admit fatigue. Doing so was seen as weakness. Coaches demanded toughness. Owners demanded silence. If your body ached, that was your problem, and your problem alone. The league wasn't built to care. And yet, some of the most haunting stories from that era are not the hits on the field, but the quiet hours after a 20-hour ride. Players walking into locker rooms half asleep, needing tape not just for their ankles, but for their eyelids. Trainers stretching men out on benches just so they could jog in warm-ups. Veterans whispering to rookies that the hardest opponent they'd ever face was in T. A rival team, it was the bus. By the time the first whistle blew, their bodies had already been defeated. Imagine lining up against a fresh opponent, a hometown hero who slept in his own bed, ate breakfast at his own table, walked a short distance to the stadium. Across from him, a visiting lineman stumbled off a bus 2 hours before kickoff, dehydrated, underfed, bruised from more than football. This was not a contest of equal preparation. It was survival versus stability. The league tried to market the grittiness as part of the sport's identity. Newspaper stories framed players as Ironmen who could take anything. A headline once bragged, "Team endures all-night ride to victory," as though it were a badge of honor. What those papers didn't describe was the agony between the lines. The pulled hamstring that never healed. The dislocated shoulder worsened by sleeping at the wrong angle. The concussions compounded by exhaustion. In glorifying resilience, the media ignored the suffering. And there was something darker, too. Owners and promoters knew the travel was brutal. They knew players suffered. But the cost of a bus was cheap, and the price of players was cheaper. They could be replaced. Men lined up outside tryouts for $25 and a chance at glory. If one broke down, another would take his spot. That expendability fed the culture of silence. Few dared complain, because complaints ended careers. Over the decades, stories piled up like scars. Former stars recalled how they dreaded the road more than the game itself. One spoke of a ride through the Midwest in winter, where frost coated the inside of the windows and players huddled in silence, teeth chattering, afraid to sleep because of the cold. Another remembered riding back with a broken collarbone, every pothole sending shockwaves of pain through his chest. Those weren't isolated miseries. They were the fabric of football's hidden history. The tragedy is not just the injuries themselves, but the normalization of them. Players convinced themselves it was the price of greatness. They wore pain as a uniform. They laughed off the swelling, the stiffness, the inability to lift their arms above their heads after a ride. It wasn't bravery. It was survival instinct, wrapped in denial. And it built a legacy of suffering that still shadows the game today. When we talk about football's dangers, we often speak of collisions, concussions, and broken bones. But the hidden killer was monotony. Hours spent locked inside a vibrating coffin of steel and glass, where each mile stripped the body of strength. It was a form of attrition that no crowd ever saw, but every player endured, and it shaped the very violence we now associate with the early league. For men who arrived broken before kickoff, brutality wasn't a choice. It was inevitable. The bus was more than transportation. It was an unspoken opponent, a punisher, a test of will, and in many ways, it won more often than it lost. And just when players thought the road couldn't take more from them, the social perception of their suffering added another layer of cruelty. Public perception is a strange and powerful thing. In the 1920s and 1930s, when football was still fighting for its place in the American imagination, the way people saw the traveling player was built on illusion. Newspapers told stories of grit. Broadcasters painted images of toughness. Owners framed hardship as a badge of honor. And fans, hungry for heroes, consumed those stories without question. To the outside world, the endless bus rides were not a curse, but a symbol of what made football special. In truth, it was a form of silent punishment that nearly broke the very men it celebrated. When we look back now, we have to understand the context. America was still a country obsessed with the frontier myth. The idea that real men endured, conquered, and suffered in silence. Hardship wasn't just tolerated, it was glorified. So when football teams rolled into town after 20 hours on a bus, stiff and sleepless, they weren't pitied. They were admired. The struggle itself was part of the spectacle. The visiting team still found a way to win despite the miles. The narrative was simple. They were tougher than the rest. That narrative wasn't written by accident. Owners and promoters needed it. The early league had no television deals, no billion-dollar contracts, no national advertising. What it had was mythology, and the myth of the road warrior, a man who endured storms, broken seats, hunger, exhaustion, and then stepped onto the field without flinching, sold tickets. The reality, of course, was something no promoter wanted to admit. The reality was swollen knees, inflamed backs, missed meals, and the creeping despair of men who knew their bodies were failing before their lives had even begun to unfold. For the fans, the misery was invisible. The stands filled on Sundays with men in wool coats, women in hats, children waving programs. They saw only the ritual of the game, the whistle, the line of scrimmage, the collisions that echoed across wooden bleachers. They cheered for touchdowns and cursed missed tackles. They never saw the players stumble off buses at dawn, rubbing life back into their legs. They never saw linemen tape swollen ankles in hotel hallways because there wasn't space inside. They never smelled the sweat of bodies unwashed for a day and a half because roadside stops didn't allow showers. That world was hidden because to show it would ruin the myth. The press carried that myth forward. Writers called them Iron Men. Columnists described their ability to shake off fatigue as if it were nothing more than dust. 1. Midwest paper in the late 1920s wrote, "They arrived weary from the road, but their spirit was unbroken." The words sounded heroic. They sounded noble. But they concealed more than they revealed. To frame men as iron was to deny their humanity. Iron doesn't bruise. Iron doesn't swell. Iron doesn't limp into old age with pain so deep it feels like fire. By calling them iron, the public was spared the guilt of knowing these athletes were flesh and bone, being worn down for someone else's entertainment. Players themselves lived in that contradiction. Privately, many admitted to pride in the headlines. Being seen as indestructible gave meaning to the suffering. If you were going to spend 20 hours folded into a bus seat, at least the world recognized your endurance. But the pride was layered with bitterness. They knew the headlines never mentioned the hunger of skipping a meal to save money. The frost that crept into their bones on unheated winter rides, the humiliation of being paid less than a dock worker, while being praised as living legends. To the public, they were warriors. To themselves, they were commodities, worn down and easily replaced. Consider the economics. A $25 paycheck for a week's game. After a ride that could stretch across half the country, adjusted for inflation, it barely scratched a living wage. And yet, the way it was told in newspapers, that pay became part of the nobility. The story wasn't a man risking his future for pennies. It was a man so devoted to the game. He'd endure anything for the chance to play. This reframing was critical. By making poverty and punishment look like honor, the system could continue. Fans would never demand better treatment for players they believed were already living a kind of heroic dream. It's worth comparing to baseball of the same era. Ball players also traveled, often on trains. But trains had sleeping cars. They had dining compartments. They offered at least the semblance of rest. Football's traveling men had none of that. Their myth was rougher, their image grittier. It fit the sport's identity as something raw, dangerous, closer to the soil of America itself. Baseball was the national pastime. Football, with its buses and bruises, was the national trial by fire. And fans loved the idea of men passing through that trial. There were, however, cracks in the story. A handful of journalists did notice the toll. Buried in old archives are lines like the visiting squad looked weary from the road, or fatigue evident in the late stages. These were quiet acknowledgments, small hints that something was off, but they never rose above the roar of the dominant narrative. No one wanted to spoil the myth. Editors wanted circulation, not sympathy. Owners wanted revenue, not reform. And fans wanted heroes, not martyrs. The result was a silencing of truth. Players learned quickly that to complain was to invite ridicule. If you admitted fatigue, you were soft. If you admitted pain, you were replaceable. Toughness was the currency of survival. So they endured in silence, reinforcing the very myth that imprisoned them. The cycle was cruel and unbreakable. Suffer, be praised for suffering, keep suffering. Years later, when these men reflected on their lives, you can hear the tension in their voices. They remembered the admiration, the sense of purpose, the pride in being called indestructible. But they also remembered the emptiness. They remembered being discarded once their bodies gave out. They remembered the bitterness of knowing the world loved their myth, not their reality. They remembered aching in middle age while the game they had built from blood and miles passed them by. This is the haunting truth. The suffering was not just ignored, it was celebrated. It wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was placed on a pedestal and sold as virtue. The more miserable the journey, the more noble the story. The more battered the player, the more heroic the headline. The early NFL didn't just demand pain, it turned pain into product. That legacy is why this chapter matters. Because it shaped football's DNA. It told generations of athletes that to hurt was to prove yourself, that to endure was to be authentic, that to suffer in silence was the highest form of loyalty. And once those ideas took hold, they never left. Even today, echoes remain in the culture of toughing it out, of playing through pain, of never admitting weakness. The seeds were planted in the age of the bus ride. And perhaps most chilling of all, the very myth that glorified them made them invisible. Fans adored the idea of the indestructible traveler, but the men behind it faded into shadows. Their suffering was rewritten into legend, and legends cannot complain. They can only endure. But behind the myth, behind the headlines and applause, there was another force at work. One even more relentless than public perception. It wasn't just culture that kept the players on those buses. It was economics, cold, ruthless, and inescapable. When the men stepped off those battered buses, their bodies ached as though they had been through combat. In many ways, they had. 20 hours folded into cramped steel frames, with knees jammed against splintering seats and backs pressed against the rattling walls, left them battered before they ever touched the field. But the real torment wasn't just physically, was the gnawing realization that this cycle would repeat. Week after week, with no relief in sight. Imagine it. You're a man in your 20s, hardened by war or poverty, proud to wear a uniform that says professional football player. Yet, the reality of your profession is a life that leaves you weaker with every mile. Your diet is no better than a traveling circus accideli sandwiches, tinned beans, coffee, too bitter to soothe the stomach. Your rest comes in fragments. A stolen nap at a gas station. A stiff doze on a stranger's floor when the team can't afford lodging, sleep, food, comfort, all luxuries. And yet, when you stagger onto the field, the fans roar as if you've arrived in glory, never knowing you spent the night beside a rattling radiator in some nameless town. The NFL of the 1920s sold itself as spectacle, but beneath the thin veneer of Sunday pageantry was a road system that devoured men whole. They played before 10,000, sometimes 20,000, and were hailed as heroes. But what those crowds never saw was what happened after the game, when the players limped back to their buses, carrying bags so tattered they barely clung to the straps, and set out again on another 20-hour purgatory. The applause faded by Monday, but the bruises from wooden seats never did. And the strangest cruelty was this: the road was as much a part of the game as the field itself. If you were a Chicago Cardinal, you didn't just prepare to face Green Bay or Rock Island. You prepared to endure the 400 miles that would get you there. Coaches didn't just draw up plays. They calculated how long it would take to recover from travel before men could even lift their heads. Teams didn't keep depth charts only for injury. They kept them for endurance. Who could handle the trip? Who could survive 2 days without sleep? Who could still stand upright when the whistle blew? Football in the 1920s wasn't just about strength or speed. It was about survival on America's backroads. For many players, the greatest opponent was time itself. A 20-hour bus ride might leave them with less than half a day to recover before kickoff. But bodies never healed. Their legs carried fatigue like lead weights. Concussions blurred into migraines, but who could tell the difference after 40 hours awake? They weren't just playing on fumes. They were playing on nothing at all. Yet they kept going because the alternative was worse. No paycheck, no recognition, no chance to keep the fragile dream alive. The public, of course, remained blind to this. Newspapers spoke of rivalries, of touchdowns scored in mud, of heroic stands against overwhelming odds. But those same articles never noted that half the team was already crippled by travel. The headlines celebrated victories as if they were forged in glory, but the truth was they were often forged in exhaustion. The margin between winning and losing came down not just to talent, but to who had managed to fall asleep for 2 hours between Peoria and Kenosha. Every mile chipped away at the men's humanity. Their hands grew calloused not only from catching leather balls, but from pushing stalled buses through the slush of winter roads. Their lungs burned not only from the collision of bodies, but from breathing in coal dust and exhaust fumes that seeped through broken windows. In those moments, the dream of professional football felt like a cruel joke. They weren't living like athletes. They were living like migrants, always on the move, never at rest, tethered to the next payday that was never enough. And yet, there was something binding in the misery. When one man broke down, another lifted him up. They swapped blankets when the cold bit too deep, shared cigarettes to cut through fatigue, whispered jokes to fight the despair of endless nights. These weren't teammates in the modern sense, they were brothers in arms. The road carved them into a fraternity of suffering, a bond forged in hardship that no crowd could ever understand. They didn't just endure travel together, they survived it together. Still, the toll showed. Look at photographs from the late 1920s teams lined up in stiff uniforms. Their faces gaunt, eyes shadowed. These were men in their prime, yet they carried the weariness of laborers twice their age. The road aged them. Some walked away after just a season, deciding that 20 hours on a bus wasn't worth $25 in hand. Others stayed, chasing glory or simply because they had no other options. But every man who stayed knew the cost. Their bodies would break not just from tackles, but from the slow, grinding cruelty of travel. And the great irony: the league never cared. Owners saw bus tickets as a necessity, nothing more. They pinched every penny, always at the player's expense. Better seats. Too costly, overnight stays in hotels. Rare luxuries. The league's attitude was simple. If the players wanted the money, they would endure the miles, and so they did. But in doing so, they built a system that normalized suffering. It wasn't questioned, it wasn't challenged. It was simply accepted as the way things were. Decades later, the NFL would become synonymous with private jets, luxury hotels, and carefully managed itineraries. But in the 1920s, survival meant clinging to the back of a rumbling bus, praying it wouldn't break down in the dead of night. That was the reality. No glory, no glamour. Just 20 hours of pain for $25 in pay. This was the hidden foundation of professional football. Men who endured the unendurable, not just on the field, but on the road, all so the league could exist at all. And that road, rough and merciless, became the silent partner of every season, every game, every fleeting victory. The players weren't just battling opponents. They were battling the very geography of America itself. And if you want to understand how the NFL was truly built not in boardrooms, not in headlines, but in blood and exhaust, you knew. Have to start there. On those buses with men who carried more than pads and helmets. They carried the weight of a dream that was already costing them everything. Because the nightmare wasn't just the game. The nightmare was getting to the game. And the nightmare was only deepening because as the league grew, the distances stretched wider, the roads rougher, and the demands harsher. The journey had only begun. The road has a way of breaking men down, not just in muscle and bone, but in the quiet places of the mind. 20 hours on a bus doesn't just test your back or your knees. It tests your patience, it tests your sanity, and it tests your dignity. By the time the players of those early leagues stumbled into a motel at dawn, their faces weren't just tired, they were hollow. Something about those rides ate at them, was more than fatigue. It was the sense that their lives, their worth, their future, had all been chained to the rattling floorboards of a bus. I remember reading a quote from an old lineman who said, "After a while, you stop talking. You just stare out the window, and the miles feel like they're staring back at you." That wasn't just exhaustion. That was despair dressed up as silence. Every bump in the road became a reminder that they were trapped in a cycle they didn't. Control that someone else, an owner, a league official, a man in a suit who never boarded these buses, was deciding how much of their humanity was worth. And the cruelest part? It was never worth much. Most players on those journeys made $25 a game, some even less. They played through bruises that turned purple, through concussions that blurred vision, through backs that locked up so badly they needed help just standing upright. But when payday came, the envelope handed out by an owner or manager felt more like an insult than a reward. By the time they counted the bills and paid for food, paid for laundry, sent money back home, there wasn't much left. And so the cycle began again. Another bus, another broken night of sleep. Another game that would demand everything from their bodies for almost nothing in return. Psychologically, it wore them thin. Teammates snapped at each other in the tight quarters. Old resentments grew louder as the miles dragged on. Some players turned to cards or dice games to numb the monotony, others to bottles tucked under their seats. But when the distractions wore off, when the cards were folded and the last drink swallowed, the same emptiness stared back. They were professionals in name only. Men who bore the title of football player, but lived like itinerant workers. Shuffled from town to town without stability, without recognition, without respect. Owners loved to call it grit. They loved to sell the story of tough men chasing a dream across the highways of America. But grit was just a mask. The truth was exploitation. These men were commodities, moved around the map not for glory, but for gate receipts. Owners would pocket the lion's share of the earnings, while the players whose sweat and sacrifice built the spectacle were left with scraps. There's a particular cruelty in watching someone suffer and branding it noble. The bus rides became a story of resilience in newspapers, as though the misery was a badge of honor. But when you spoke to the men themselves, you heard something different. You heard about depression. You heard about loneliness. You heard about nights where they stared at the ceiling of a cheap room and wondered how long they could last. The constant motion stripped away stability. Families rarely saw them. Wives raised children in absentia. Parents grew older without sons at home. Players were caught in between two, underpaid to feel secure, to bound by loyalty and pride to walk away. And so they endured. But endurance is not the same as strength. It's survival. And survival leaves scars. The financial strain deepened the psychological wounds. Imagine finishing a 20-hour bus ride, suiting up, taking hit after hit on the field, only to receive a paycheck that barely covered your expenses. One former player said it bluntly, "We were living like we were broke and playing like we were rich." The two realities never matched. That contradiction gnawed at them. It bred resentment toward owners who arrived at games in tailored suits, toward coaches who spoke of sacrifice but never climbed onto the bus, toward fans who cheered as if glory alone was enough to fill a stomach. Players began to see themselves as pawns, useful only until their bodies broke, disposable once they could no longer carry the burden of travel and violence combined. And still, they kept going. Why? Because the alternative was worse. Most came from working-class backgrounds, from towns where steel mills and coal mines were the only other options. Football, even in its most brutal form, offered something the mills could not. A glimpse, however faint, of escape. Owners knew this. They preyed on it. They dangled just enough money, just enough hope, to keep men tied to the buses, chained to the cycle of sacrifice. The psychological strain wasn't just individual, it was collective. Teams fractured under the weight of poverty and exhaustion. Jealousies emerged between players who seemed to get more playing time, or a slightly larger cut of pay. Trust eroded, and with it, the camaraderie that football depended on. When men are trapped together in suffering, they either grow closer, or they grow apart. More often than not, the buses push them apart. The deeper tragedy was that fans never saw this side. They saw the touchdowns, the tackles, the highlights. They saw men running onto fields with fire in their eyes and energy in their steps. What they didn't see were the silent stares out of bus windows at 3 a.m., the sleepless nights, the quiet tears shed in the back rows. They didn't see the toll of being treated as expendable labor, of realizing that no matter how many hits they took, no matter how many miles they logged, the system was designed to bleed them dry. I've often wondered how many potential stars the league lost in those years, not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked the will to endure the grind. How many great careers ended before they began, suffocated not by injuries, but by despair? That's the hidden cost of those journeys. Not just the pain inflicted, but the dreams extinguished along the way. The bus became more than transportation. It became a symbol, a rolling prison that carried men not toward opportunity, but toward exhaustion. And when the doors opened after another endless ride, what spilled out wasn't just a team. It was a collection of men on the edge, bodies battered, minds frayed, pockets light. And that's where the darkest truth emerges. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Owners wanted maximum output for minimum investment. The buses, the long hours, the meager path, they weren't accidents. They were strategies. Strategies that kept players desperate, compliant, and replaceable. For the men on those buses, the journey wasn't just physical. It was psychological warfare, waged quietly, mile after mile. And the scars it left weren't visible under pads or helmets. They lived in silence, in doubt, in the erosion of hope. What happens to a sport when its foundation is built not on glory, but on exploitation? What happens to men when their sacrifices are reduced to footnotes, while the profits they generate build empires for others? Those are the questions that haunt the road stories of football's past. And the answers only grow darker the deeper you look. The machinery of professional football has always had two engines: the bodies of players and the pockets of owners. And when you peel back the glossy veneer of the sport, you see how ruthlessly those engines were calibrated. Owners treated players like assets to be purchased cheap, driven hard, and discarded when their value dipped. The system was precise, efficient, cold. The bus rides weren't just about getting from one city to another. They were about cost-cutting. They were about an owner deciding that 20 hours on a bus was cheaper than 2 hours on a train or a quick flight. The suffering of players wasn't collateral damage, was the business plan. Keep expenses low, profits high, and the burden squarely on the men least able to push back. I think often about the way these stories were framed to the public. Newspapers of the 1930s and 1940s would praise owners for running a lean operation, for keeping their club solvent in tough times. What wasn't printed were the private tolls. The men who slept upright, who missed meals, who took the field in a fog of exhaustion. Fans were taught to admire thrift, but thrift was another word for exploitation. Players knew it. They felt it in their bones, in their empty wallets, in the way their careers could vanish with a single injury. But there was no union yet, no collective bargaining, no grievance process. Complaining was dangerous. It could mean being cut, replaced by the next hungry man willing to endure. Owners exploited that vulnerability with precision. And what happens to a man when he learns, over and over again, that his pain has no value? That his effort, his sacrifice, his very health are all negotiable. That knowledge doesn't vanish when the bus ride ends. It settles deep inside, reshaping how he sees himself, how he trusts others, how he imagines his future. The result was a quiet epidemic of mental strain. Depression wasn't a word men of that era used. They called it feeling low or the blues. But the signs are clear when you look back. Players isolating themselves, drinking too much, growing volatile in locker rooms or withdrawing into silence. One teammate recalled that after long trips, you could tell who was cracking. Some guys just stared at the ground all week. They were gone, even if they were still there. The pressure didn't end with retirement. In fact, it often grew worse. Men who had been cheered on Sundays returned home to no fanfare, no safety net, no savings. They had injuries that made ordinary work difficult and minds clouded by years of unacknowledged trauma. Owners moved on to the next season, the next crop of players, the next profit. The men left behind carried the weight alone. The cruelty of the system was that it demanded loyalty from players, but offered none in return. The men on those buses gave their bodies to the game, and in exchange, they received checks too small to build security, recognition too fleeting to last, and scars too deep to erase. The machinery of football had churned them through, efficient and merciless, until they were no longer useful. It is here, at the intersection of greed and mental strain, that the darkness of the sport is most visible. Because the exploitation wasn't abstract, it was personal. It lived in the way an owner pocketed gate receipts while a player limped into a boarding house, wondering how he'd afford his next meal. It lived in the way exhaustion bred anger, anger bred isolation, and isolation hollowed men from the inside out. Some broke publicly, in fights or scandals. Others broke privately, in silence. Either way, the cost was real. The machinery didn't just burn out bodies. It fractured minds. And yet, through it all, the league celebrated growth. More teams, more fans, more money. The narrative was progress. But progress for whom? Not for the men hunched in bus seats. Not for the men staring into dark motel ceilings, trying to quiet the storms in their heads. Progress belonged to the owners, the businessmen who perfected the art of squeezing maximum profit from minimum investment. The irony is that the very suffering of players became part of the mythology. Fans admired the toughness, the endurance, the ability to play through unimaginable circumstances. That mythology sold tickets. It filled stadiums. It made the game larger than life. But the men who lived it were not larger than life. They were human. And the cost of the myth was their well-being. When I think about those early decades of the NFL, I don't just see the games. I see the buses. I see the machinery of a system that reduced men to parts in an engine, parts that could be swapped out the moment they wore down. And I see the toll it left behind, not just in broken bones, but in broken spirits. Because football wasn't just a sport, it was an industry. And in that industry, players weren't heroes. They were labor, cheap, replaceable, and always at the mercy of greed. The darkness of that truth lingers, even today, because the machinery never really stopped. It only evolved. The road never ended. It stretched on like an unbroken test of will, a place where players learned the true meaning of exhaustion. The public saw the games. They saw the touchdowns, the bruising tackles, the spectacle of Sunday afternoons. What they didn't see were the endless miles in between, the journeys that hollowed men out long before they ever stepped onto the field. For players in the early days of professional football, travel was not a side detail, was the crucible. Teams without money were bound to buses. Railroads were for the wealthier franchises, the rare clubs with stable owners and packed stadiums. But for most, the default was a coach that rattled and shook across the backroads of America. 20 or more men squeezed into seats that weren't designed for giants. Their equipment was stuffed under benches, their cleats digging into their knees as the miles crawled by. The conditions were brutal. Imagine playing a full-contact sport, body battered and bruised, and then climbing aboard a bus for 15 or 20 hours, legs swelling, joints stiffening. The heat stifling in summer, the cold unbearable in winter. Rest stops were unreliable. Meals were usually whatever small diners happened to be open along the way, cheap sandwiches. Lukewarm coffee, a few minutes of rest before the driver barked that it was time to move again. The smell lingered. Wet wool from uniforms, sweat soaked into the seats, cigarette smoke hanging in the air. One lineman, years later, would say that what stayed with him wasn't the games themselves, but the smell of those trips. It became the permanent memory of his career. For every hard tackle, every touchdown, every injury, there was the bus. It was always waiting, and the danger was constant. Roads in the 1920s and 1930s were rough, often unpaved and rarely lit. Accidents happened often. Tires blew, brakes gave out. There were nights when players would climb down into ditches, waiting while a mechanic tried to patch the bus back together. There were nights when they simply sat in silence, the wind seeping in through broken windows, knowing that kickoff was only hours away. For some, the game was lost before it even began. This was the hidden tax of the sport. The newspaper box scores told one story, but the real story started on the road. A team arriving exhausted, hungry, and sore was already defeated before they faced their opponent. Victories and losses weren't decided only on the field. They were shaped by the journeys that preceded them. And what made it worse was the pay. Men endured these grueling trips for almost nothing. $25 for a game that could leave you concussed, broken, or cut from the roster entirely. That money barely covered living expenses. Many players would spend their wages on meals during the trip and have little left over when they returned home. Some joked about it, using dark humor to soften the truth. Veterans would tell rookies, "The bus is your real home. The field's just where we visit." But under the laughter was bitterness. Everyone knew the truth. The road was breaking them down faster than the collisions ever could. The psychological toll was just as heavy as the physical one. Players spent hours staring out windows, lost in silence, wondering how much longer they could last. Some admitted later that the loneliness of travel nearly destroyed them. They missed their families, missed milestones at home, missed any sense of normal life. The bus was a prison, and its sentence was indefinite. And still, the league sold the illusion of glamour. Posters and newspaper spreads presented football as the future of American sport, a theater of toughness and glory. Photographs showed square-jawed men staring bravely into the distance, images carefully curated to project strength. But those same men knew the truth. They weren't gladiators, they were laborers, disposable and unprotected, pushed from one town to another on schedules that ignored human limits. The cruelest part was how little recognition the suffering received. Fans cheered when their team triumphed, never thinking about what came before the sleepless nights, the cheap food, the bone-deep exhaustion from another day trapped in motion. They never thought about the men who collapsed before the game even started. Drained by the miles that separated small towns from stadiums. The bus revealed everything. It revealed the physical limits of the body, as joints locked up and muscles cramped. It revealed the emotional limits of the mind. As players confessed their doubts and whispered conversations while the rest of the team slept. Some played only for pride, others because they had nowhere else to go. But everyone knew the same truth. The road was harder than the game itself. And it is here that the mythology of the NFL collides with reality. Football was sold as spectacle, a place where men became legends. But the legends weren't created only in stadiums. They were forged in silence, on the highways, in the long nights of travel where resilience mattered more than strength. Where survival was measured not by the scoreboard, but by the ability to keep going despite it all. Fans never heard that soundtrack. It was until the roar of a crowd or the crack of helmets. It was the drone of an engine. The rattle of windows, the tired sigh of men too exhausted to speak. That was football's hidden music. The rhythm of the road, playing endlessly between Sunday afternoons. To understand the early NFL, you must understand that music. You must hear the endless hum of tires and the slow collapse of bodies that were asked to give too much for too little. The story of football is not just about touchdowns and trophies. It is about the cost of getting there. And in that cost lies the darker truth of the game. A truth rarely spoken, rarely remembered. The truth that the road itself was the NFL's silent opponent, as punishing as any defender, as relentless as any collision. The road decided careers. It shaped outcomes. It crushed spirits. And in the end, it claimed more men than any hit ever could. The bus never made the highlight reels, but it should have. Because for every game you remember, there was a journey you never saw, an invisible struggle that drained men before they even reached the field. And for every player who lasted, dozens disappeared, worn down not by the violence of the game, but by the road that carried them to it. The miles stretched on, unbroken, unforgiving, and the game was never the same. The cost of football was never confined to the field. For many of the men who played in the earliest decades, the most punishing battles took place far from the roar of the stadium. They took place in the stillness of a midnight bus ride. In the distance that grew between a player and his family. In the relentless erosion of body and mind that came from living a life in constant motion. It was not just the collisions that broke them. It was absence. The absence from birthdays, anniversaries, and dinners around the table. The absence from their children's first steps or their parents' final breaths. Football, in its infancy, demanded not only sweat and blood, demanded presence itself. And when men gave it, they discovered that what waited for them in return was often silence. The road kept them away from home for days, sometimes weeks, at a time. A 20-hour bus ride to a game meant 40 hours round trip, and the schedule rarely allowed for recovery. Some players described feeling more like migrants than professionals, drifting from one town to the next with no roots. They returned home strangers, their kids hesitant, their wives hardened by the burden of managing everything alone. Letters carried their voices when their bodies couldn't. Handwritten notes mailed from obscure towns, apologizing for missed moments, promising better days that never seemed to arrive. One wife later recalled that she read more words from her husband on paper than she ever heard. From his mouth in person during the prime of his playing career, the game consumed not only the men who played it, but the families tethered to them. Wives bore the loneliness, the unpaid bills, the fear of injuries they couldn't afford to treat. Children grew up idolizing fathers they rarely saw, fathers who were broken in body and spirit when they did finally come home. This was the hidden toll of the road. Not just exhaustion, but estrangement. And yet, the bus never paused. Its wheels turned, mile after mile, dragging men deeper into a cycle that left them physically ruined and emotionally distant. Joints stiffened in the cramped seats. Back injuries worsened, concussions lingered untreated. A man might arrive at a game already half broken, forced to play through pain, because there was no financial cushion if he sat out. To miss a game was to risk losing his spot. To complain was to risk being labeled soft. So they endured, quietly, until the silence consumed them. The financial reality compounded the misery. $25 for a game might cover groceries or rent, but it could not mend the cracks forming in marriages. It could not buy back missed time with children. It could not heal the injuries that grew worse with each mile. The NFL was a business that thrived on the expendability of its players, and the road was the delivery system for that exploitation. Those who tried to balance football with family often failed. Divorce rates among early players were high, though statistics were rarely kept. Many quietly separated, unable to withstand the long absences and the financial instability. Some simply disappeared from their families' lives, swallowed up by the grind of the road, and then there were the tragedies. Stories circulated of players who collapsed from exhaustion mid-season, who died young from untreated conditions made worse by the strain of travel and unrelenting games. Families were left behind with nothing, no pension, no support, only memories of a father or husband who sacrificed everything for a sport that gave back so little. This was not the glamorous vision of football that newspapers sold. Fans saw the spectacle, but never the shadow it cast over kitchens and bedrooms across America. They cheered the touchdowns, never realizing those points had been purchased with broken marriages and neglected children. They celebrated heroes who returned home not to parades, but to estrangement and regret. One former player, years later, admitted that he remembered almost none of the scores or standings from his career. What he remembered was his daughter refusing to call him dad, because he was never there. He remembered the way his wife's voice sounded in letters, colder with each passing season until the letters stopped coming altogether. The bus had carried him across America, but it had driven him out of his own home. At the same time, the physical punishment compounded everything. Sleep was nearly impossible on a bus rattling through the night. Muscles stiffened, blood pooled in swollen legs, headaches lingered from dehydration and smoke-filled cabins. By the time players stepped onto the field, they were not at their best. They were shells of themselves, pushed to perform despite bodies that begged for rest. The logistics were equally cruel. Poorly planned routes meant that some teams traveled longer distances than their opponents, arriving at games already depleted. Meals were scarce, training conditions non-existent, recovery impossible. The sport was not decided solely by skill or preparation. It was decided by who could survive the travel long enough to stand upright at kickoff. And yet, the owners rarely noticed or cared. As long as a team showed up to play, the details were irrelevant. The human beings inside those buses were simply assets, their well-being secondary to ticket sales. The players knew it, felt it, resented it. But without unions, without bargaining power, they endured. The road became a silent adversary, eroding not only their bodies, but their humanity. It created distance not measured in miles, but in the widening gaps between fathers and children, husbands and wives, men and their own sense of purpose. Football became less a profession and more a slow unraveling. And still they played. Because for all its cruelty, the game was also their one chance at meaning, at identity, at fleeting glory. The price was everything else. That price is rarely acknowledged in the official histories of the sport. Highlight reels do not show the hollow eyes of men arriving home to families they barely recognized. Record books do not list the marriages ended, the children estranged, the funerals unattended because the schedule did not allow for grief. The official story of the NFL is one of triumph, but its truer story is one of absence, and absence felt most profoundly not by fans, but by the people who loved the men inside those uniforms. As the league grew, the distances only expanded. Teams traveled farther, schedules grew more punishing, and the stakes climbed higher. The bus rides that once defined the sport gave way to new forms of travel, but the consequences remained. Time away from family. Time away from healing. Time sacrificed to a game that demanded more than any paycheck could ever justify. And so, in the silence of the road, football revealed itself. It revealed what it was willing to take. It revealed who paid the real cost. The story of the NFL is not just about touchdowns, victories, or championships. It is about the men who gave everything and the families who were left with nothing. It is about the road that stretched endlessly forward, carrying them away from the people they loved, toward games that would soon be forgotten. And it is about the question that lingered in the silence of every mile. How much is a man willing to lose for the sake of a game that will never remember his name? The miles rolled on, the distance grew, and the cost of the game was counted not only in bruises and broken bones, but in broken homes and broken hearts. The road was merciless. It stripped away comfort, dignity, and sometimes even hope. But in that void, something else emerged, something that could not be manufactured or bought. It was brotherhood, born not from choice, but from necessity. On those endless bus rides, men found one another in ways the rest of the world could never understand. They shared aches, shared hunger, shared the gnawing silence of miles that would not end. They knew the same exhaustion, the same fear of injuries, the same doubts about whether their sacrifices were worth it. And in that shared suffering, bonds formed that went deeper than the game itself. There were nights when laughter carried them through, crude jokes told in the dim light of a moving bus. Laughter became medicine, a fragile shield against the pain. There were mornings when songs broke out, players humming or singing in unison, their voices rising over the hum of the engine. It was unti, the sound of joy so much as defiance and insistence on being human in a system that treated them like cargo. Brotherhood filled the spaces that the league left empty. Owners didn't care about their health. Fans didn't see their exhaustion, but the man sitting next to you on the bus did. He saw your swollen knee. He saw the way your hand trembled after another concussion. He knew when you were too tired to keep going, and he pushed you anyway, because he needed you to push him too. It wasn't friendship in the ordinary sense. It was survival. Each man's strength depended on the other's. The team was not just a roster, it was a lifeline. To endure the road meant leaning on one another, finding comfort in the shared knowledge that no one else on earth could possibly understand what they were enduring. And yet, the cruel irony was that this same bond was forged under exploitation. They were united against the indifference of the very institution that should have protected them. The league paid them scraps, shuffled them from town to town, ignored their suffering. Owners pitted players against one another when it came to contracts. But on the bus, those same men became brothers, bound not by loyalty to management, but by loyalty to each other. Stories spread of players pooling their meager paychecks to cover a teammate's medical bills, or to send money back to a family in need. Some carried extra sandwiches from roadside diners, saving them for rookies too broke to buy a meal. Others offered shoulders to lean on, both literally and emotionally, when a man's body or spirit finally gave out. In those cramped spaces, life became brutally honest. There was no hiding pain, no pretending everything was fine. If you were broken, the man next to you knew it. If you were afraid, someone else was too. Vulnerability became a strange form of strength because it made the bonds stronger. These were not polished superstars. They were men, fragile and flawed, clinging to one another as the road demanded more than any one of them could endure alone. The brotherhood extended beyond the bus. On the field, they played not just for victory, but for one another. You ran harder because the man next to you had endured the same 20-hour ride. You fought through the pain because you knew he was fighting too. And when you collapsed, it was your brothers who pulled you back to your feet. But the system they were trapped in never acknowledged that bond. To the league, they were replaceable parts. Contracts were short, protections non-existent. A man could be cut after a single bad game, his place on the bus given to someone younger, cheaper, healthier. The brotherhood was all they had, and that's what made it sacred. Decades later, many players spoke of the games with pride. But when they grew older, it was not the touchdowns they remembered most. It was the moments on the road. The quiet conversations, the shared cigarettes, the unspoken understanding that they were all in this together. The statistics faded. The bonds did not. Still, the contradiction was painful. The brotherhood softened the edges of suffering, but it could not erase the fact that these men were being used. They comforted one another in the face of systemic neglect, but the system never changed. Their loyalty to each other was profound, but it was also a reminder of what the league denied them: loyalty, respect, and dignity. In that way, their brotherhood was both salvation and tragedy. Salvation, because it kept them alive through nights that might have otherwise broken them. Tragedy, because it was built on pain that should never have been inflicted in the first place. There is an old saying among athletes: you never forget the locker room. For these men, you never forgot the bus. The bus was the crucible, and the man sitting beside you was your only shield. When the league ignored you, when the fans misunderstood you, when the road tried to break you, the brotherhood held. But it came at a cost. The more they leaned on one another, the more they saw the cracks in the system. They knew that they deserved better. They knew that their suffering was not inevitably was designed. The bus trips, the low pay, the endless injuries, these were not accidents. They were choices made by owners who valued profit over humanity. And so the brotherhood became more than survival. It became quiet resistance. It planted the seeds of something larger, the idea that players, united, could someday push back. The road, brutal as it was, created not just camaraderie, but consciousness. Every mile deepened their bond, but also their awareness of exploitation. They began to whisper about fairness, about dignity, about the possibility of demanding more. Those whispers would grow louder in the decades to come. They would shape the battles for player unions, for pensions, for basic protections that today are taken for granted. But in the early years, it started here on the bus, in the dark, where men carried one another through suffering that no one else could see. The brotherhood was real. It was sacred. It was everything. And it was also the clearest proof that the system had failed them. Because when the league turned its back, the only thing left was each other. And that was both their greatest strength, then the clearest sign of just how much had been stolen from them. The road moved on. The brotherhood held. And in that fragile balance, the future of the sport was quietly being written. The 1960s were supposed to be the turning of a page. But for many men in professional football, they felt more like the sharpening of a blade. The game was faster, the money slightly better, the spotlight brighter. Yet behind the curtain, the travel, the injuries, the indignities they all endured, still cut the same way they had in the decades before. Only now, a new tension entered the room. Some players had tasted enough of the bitter truth to start asking questions. They had seen too many broken bodies, too many unpaid bills, too many nights sleeping in bus depots after a so-called professional game. The stirrings of resistance, of organizing, of demanding something more than scraps began to form in whispers. But football's story has always been one of dualities. For every man who tried to raise his voice, another fell into silence, buried under personal ruin. While collective resistance was just beginning to stir, individual tragedies piled up at the same pace. Tragedies that would become warnings, lessons, and sometimes sacrifices that fueled the cause. In 1968, as America itself roared with protest, civil rights marches, anti-war rallies, and student movements, a quieter but no less meaningful confrontation simmered within the game. The NFL Players Association had existed since the mid-1950s, but only in name, a weak body with little leverage. By the late 60s, bolstered by a younger generation unafraid of confrontation, it began to demand basic rights: pensions, minimum salaries, access to medical coverage, protections for men who left the field with bodies broken beyond repair. These were not luxuries, they were survival measures. Consider John Wooten, a guard for the Cleveland Browns, who spoke about the indignity of being treated like replaceable parts. You knew that once you couldn't T-play, you were done. You'd get a handshake maybe, and that was it. Guys were left with nothing. No job, no help with their injuries, no way to provide for their families. His words echoed what hundreds felt but could not say. For every player like Wooten who spoke openly, dozens bit their tongues, fearful of being cut, blackballed, erased from the league entirely. And yet, while these sparks of solidarity grew, the personal costs of silence continued to mount. Stories emerged of men like Leon Clark, once a promising receiver, who found himself years later working manual labor jobs with knees that barely bent, his football paychecks long spent, his health insurance non-existent, or the countless players who slid into alcoholism, their only escape from the relentless pain that followed them after the cheering stopped. I think of Willie Wood, the Hall of Fame safety for the Packers, who admitted later that he underwent multiple surgeries, lived with chronic pain, and found himself nearly destitute despite his fame. "The game gave me everything, and it took everything away," he confessed. Wood's story was echoed in the lives of dozens of lesser-known men, players whose names never touched a Hall of Fame ballot but whose bodies carried the same scars. The duality sharpened into a haunting rhythm. On one hand, union leaders argued for pensions, for minimum salaries, for medical protections. On the other, individual players quietly slipped into poverty, unable to afford rent, much less a doctor's visit. The juxtaposition was damning, while the collective fight hinted at progress. The individual tragedies exposed just how long the road would be. When the NFL merged with the AFL in 1970, bringing together rival leagues into one unified powerhouse, many fans saw only the triumph of spectacle. Bigger games, more television deals, a stage that grew by the year. But for the players, the merger sharpened their frustrations. The money flowing into owners' pockets seemed endless, yet the men on the field, the ones taking the hits, enduring the travel, living with injuries, remained disposable. I remember hearing stories of players crammed into second-rate hotels, even as networks poured millions into broadcasting deals. The disconnect was staggering. Owners profited on the backs of men who were still expected to ride buses, share rooms, and leave the game with nothing but pain as their pension. The 1970 strike, one of the first organized work stoppages in professional football, became a flashpoint. Players demanded a minimum salary of $12,000, pensions that meant something, and medical coverage that extended beyond the final whistle of their last game. It was not a revolution, not yet. But it was the first serious moment when the collective will of players collided with the entrenched power of ownership. The strike ended with modest gains, a small pension increase, incremental salary improvements, but symbolically, it marked the first crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable. Still, as with every step forward, the personal costs kept shadowing the collective progress. For every man who marched in solidarity, there was another collapsing quietly at home. Many players could not afford to strike, living paycheck to paycheck, already carrying debts. Others, fearful of being cut, stayed silent. Some who dared to speak faced retribution. Their careers shortened or ended. The tragedies accumulated like debris. Men in their 40s living with the bodies of 80-year-olds. Marriages collapsing under financial strain. Children watching their fathers fade into bitterness. Their glory days nothing but black and white photographs. These personal unravelings became the unspoken ledger of the game's brutality. And yet, I cannot help but see how those very tragedies fed the collective cause. Each broken man became a living argument for change. Each ruined knee, each ruined family, each funeral too early. They all gave weight to the union's demands. The resistance was not abstract. It was written in the lives of men who had nothing left but their testimony. The media, too, began to shift. Reporters who once treated players as interchangeable began to listen more closely. A few dared to write about the disparity, about how men generating millions for the league could barely pay their medical bills. These articles, though limited, gave the players a platform, however small. But I think of the silence too. The silence of men who never spoke, who carried their suffering alone, who vanished from the game without recognition. For every John Wooten who spoke about pensions, for every Willie Wood who admitted his pain, there were 10 others who faded into anonymity. Their silence was both a tragedy and a shield. For to speak was to risk everything, but to remain quiet was to carry the weight alone. The story of football in those years was not simply about games, touchdowns, or championships. It was about a battle between silence and voice, between suffering and isolation and daring to resist. And it was about the cruel truth that even as collective progress was made, the individual tragedies continued without pause. I think back to the words of Jerry Kramer, the legendary guard for the Packers, who once said, "We weren't asking for the moon. Just enough to walk away with dignity." That, in essence, was the heart of the conflict. Dignity. A word so simple, so human, yet so elusive for the men who gave their bodies to the game. In the balance between collective resistance and personal unraveling, the NFL's story of the late 1960s and early 1970s found its most haunting rhythm. Progress was real, but so too was pain. Resistance was growing, but so too was silence. The game was evolving, but its players remained caught in a struggle that would not resolve for decades. It is here, in this tension, that the heart of football's hidden truth beats the loudest. The fight for justice was never clean, never straightforward, and never without sacrifice. The 1970s are remembered as football's golden decade. Television money exploded. Monday Night Football turned the game into a cultural ritual. And names like Bradshaw, Staubach, and Butkus became household legends. But behind the spectacle, the same old truths still govern the lives of the men on the buses, in the locker rooms, and in the shadows of the stadium lights. If the 60s introduced the first sparks of resistance, the 70s revealed how fragile those sparks remained. Fragile enough to be stamped out, but stubborn enough to keep glowing. The National Football League's merger with the American Football League in 1970 transformed the business of the sport. The league doubled in size. Revenue soared, and exposure reached heights unimaginable just a decade earlier. Yet, with all that wealth, the reality for most players did not reflect the headlines. Minimum salaries, even after the first strike, hovered barely above what a schoolteacher might earn. Pensions remained an afterthought. And the travel, the endless grueling miles by bus or cramped plane, continued almost unchanged. The spectacle on Sunday night masked the fact that Monday morning brought players the same aching routine: swollen joints, unpaid medical bills, and fear of being cut if they complained. I often think about the contrast, the glamour of a packed stadium on a freezing December afternoon, the roars of 60,000 fans, and then the quiet reality of the same players trying to sleep on a drafty bus rolling down a dark interstate. For many of these men, the NFL's rise to cultural dominance only deepened the sting. They were part of the machine that generated unprecedented profits, but they still lived paycheck to paycheck, often with no safety net. Take the case of Dave Maguzzi, a linebacker for the St. Louis Cardinals, who, in 1970, walked away from the game and later published a blistering memoir titled Out of Their League. Maguzzi described the system as dehumanizing, exploitative, and cruel. "You were conditioned not to think, not to question," he wrote. "You gave your body, and when it broke down, you were discarded." His account was shocking at the time, but it only confirmed what countless others had whispered privately. Maguzzi's words crystallized the duality of the era: a game celebrated on television as heroic, yet experienced by players as a grind that demanded obedience and silence. For players who stayed, silence was often the only option. The owners still held absolute power, and the union was fragile, fractured by fear. Even as players began to sense their collective strength, the system thrived on isolating them, making each man believe his survival depended on submission. Speak up, and you risked being blackballed. Stay quiet, and you carried the suffering alone. This fragile balance was tested again in 1974, when players staged another strike, demanding fairer pensions, higher minimum salaries, and the right to free agency. Owners fought back with the same ruthlessness they had always wielded. Replacement players were brought in for training camps, and the message was clear. You are all disposable. For a brief moment, unity cracked. Some players crossed picket lines out of fear or desperation. Others held firm. In the end, the strike failed to win major concessions, but like the strike in 1970, it left a symbolic mark. Every confrontation planted seeds, each one feeding a longer war that would take decades to bear fruit. Yet, while these collective battles unfolded, individual tragedies still cut the deepest. The 1970s saw more and more stories of players collapsing after the game ended, their bodies ravaged, their finances in ruins. The most haunting part was how invisible these men became. By the time they were 40, they were yesterday's news, forgotten by fans, ignored by the league. Their pain became private, their lives slipping quietly into the margins. I think of players like Mike Webster, the legendary center of the Pittsburgh Steelers. In the 70s, Webster was a pillar of the Steelers dynasty, a man who symbolized toughness and discipline. But after retirement, he descended into poverty, homelessness, and debilitating health problems. Though his full story would not emerge until the 1990s and 2000s, Webster's unraveling began in this decade. He carried the seeds of a tragedy that would later expose the league's darkest secrets about brain trauma. At the time, though, his suffering was just another silent chapter. Even players who escaped the most severe physical collapse often found themselves unprepared for life after football. The league offered little support in career transition. Education programs were minimal, financial counseling non-existent. Many men who had lived as stars on Sunday afternoons ended up working ordinary, back-breaking jobs by the time they turned 35. The dissonance between who they had been and who they became was devastating. Some drowned it in alcohol. Some fell into depression. Some simply disappeared. And still, the buses rolled on. Travel remained one of the cruel constants of the game. Stories circulated of players finishing a brutal game on Sunday, climbing onto buses through the night, and showing up at work Monday morning for second jobs. Yes, even in the 1970s, with the NFL's money pouring in, many players needed off-season or part-time employment just to survive. Teachers, salesmen, construction workers, men who had been warriors in front of millions returned quietly to the ranks of ordinary laborers. The myth of the professional athlete as wealthy and untouchable simply did not match reality. The dual rhythm of the decade was impossible to ignore. On the surface, glory. Beneath it, disrepair. The NFL became a cultural powerhouse, dominating television ratings, producing icons, embedding itself into the American identity. But inside locker rooms, on team buses, and in the homes of players, the story was far darker. Collective action struggled to take hold, while individual suffering piled higher each year. It's tempting to see the 1970s as a transitional decade, a bridge between the raw brutality of the early game and the modern spectacle we know today. But I see it as something different. It was the moment when the contradiction became undeniable. The league's power and wealth were now too vast to excuse the poverty of its players. The duality could no longer be hidden by nostalgia or myth. The cracks were visible, even if the full collapse of the old system would take years to arrive. And so the 70s ended as they began. With tension unresolved, progress incomplete, and tragedy never far from sight. The Union had not yet achieved the power it needed. the players had not yet secured the dignity they sought. The buses still carried broken men from one game to the next, even as the television cameras framed them as gods. The divide between image and reality widened, and in that divide, the real story of football's dark side continued to grow. The story of this decade is not one of resolution, but of escalation. The voices were louder, the resistance stronger, but so too was the suffering. For every inch gained, another man fell. For every public triumph, there was a private collapse. The golden decade of football was, for the men who lived it, as much a nightmare as a dream. The 1980s ushered in a new phase for professional football. Sleek and polished, framed in high-definition television broadcasts and marketed as the crown jewel of American sports. But behind that polished exterior, the old contradictions persisted, now intensified by the sheer scale of the league's growth. More money than ever poured into the NFL, and with it came promises of a better life for players. But for most men who strapped on pads during this decade, the gap between the league's wealth and their personal reality only grew more painful. The decade opened with the NFL Players Association still reeling from the failed strike of 1974. The owners had crushed the movement with ease, and for years afterward, players were reminded of their vulnerability. Yet, by 1982, the rising frustrations could no longer be contained. Salaries remained stagnant compared to the league's booming profits. Pensions were still paltry. And perhaps most galling, free agency, the ability to control one's own career, remained out of reach. Locked away by a system that treated players like property. In September 1982, the simmering resentment boiled over into a strike that lasted 57 days. For the first time in history, regular season games were canceled. Fans were furious, the media divided, but the players had reached their breaking point. The strike was framed not as greed, but as survival. They weren't asking for yachts or mansions. They were asking for a fair share of the profits, for health protections, for the dignity of being treated as men rather than replaceable assets. I remember the words of Gene Upshaw, who had transitioned from player to union leader. We're not fighting for the stars of this league. We're fighting for the guys who never make the headlines, the guys who ride the buses, who limp away from this game and get nothing for it. His voice carried the weight of men who had spent years in silence, traveling through nights on rickety buses, suffering in anonymity while the league they built grew into a billion-dollar enterprise. The 1982 strike secured modest gains, improved severance pay, a small share of revenues tied to television contracts. But once again, the results felt like drops of water on a fire that could not be extinguished. Players returned to the field, still bound by contracts that gave them little power, still living with the reality of constant travel, brutal schedules, and the ever-present risk of financial collapse when their bodies gave out. Travel in this decade remained as punishing as ever. The image of private charters and comfortable accommodations was reserved for the select few marquee teams. Many clubs still cut corners, booking commercial flights or loading players onto buses for long rides between cities. Younger fans might imagine the 1980s as an era of glamour. But the truth is harsher. Many players still spent nights curled up across two bus seats, using jackets as pillows, counting the hours until sunrise. For them, professional football was not a luxury. It was a gauntlet, and beyond the travel itself was the grinding schedule. Teams played preseason games that meant nothing except profit for owners, followed by regular seasons and playoff runs that stretched bodies to the limit. The off-season, if it could be called that, was often filled with part-time jobs. Yes, even in the booming 1980s, players who weren't stars often returned home to sell insurance, to pour concrete, to stock shelves. They might have been gladiators on Sunday, but Monday always brought the cold reminder of their reality. The tragedy of the decade was not just financial. The hidden cost was health. By now, the league had ample evidence of the long-term toll of concussions, chronic pain, and orthopedic injuries. but it chose silence. Players were injected with painkillers, pushed back onto the field, and sent onto buses with bodies that barely held together. If they broke, they were cut. If they protested, they were ignored. The system remained merciless, even as profits ballooned. One of the most powerful examples of this duality came in 1987, when players once again struck, this time demanding true free agency. The owners retaliated with a ruthless efficiency that revealed the depth of their power. They brought in replacement players, men willing to cross the picket lines, to wear the uniforms, to play in front of jeering crowds while union members stood outside in protest. The league continued, the games televised, the image of football maintained. The message to striking players was unmistakable. You are replaceable. For those who held out, the strike was both an act of courage and a test of endurance. Many players were already living paycheck to paycheck. Missing game checks meant missing mortgage payments, falling into debt, risking everything. When the strike collapsed after 24 days, the owners declared victory, but the struggle left scars. Players who had stood together felt betrayed by those who crossed the line. Careers ended prematurely. Dreams were shattered. Yet even in defeat, seeds were planted. The strikes of 1982 and 1987 forced the league, the media, and the public to confront a truth long buried. That beneath the spectacle, beneath the Sunday broadcasts, there were human beings fighting for dignity. The cracks widened. Change was not yet won, but the pressure was building. Still, for the men of the 1980s, the immediate reality was often bleak. Many limped into retirement with little more than broken bodies and broken bank accounts. The travel they endured, the miles they logged, the pain they carried. These did not vanish when the cameras turned away. I think of the stories told by linemen who described getting off buses barely able to walk, only to line up again days later for another game. I think of the players who returned home after retirement and found themselves working night shifts, their hands swollen from years in the trenches, their backs screaming with every movement. And I think, too, of the silence that persisted. The NFL mastered the art of myth-making in the 1980s. The league sold itself as heroic, glamorous, unstoppable. It crafted highlight reels, Super Bowl spectacles, halftime shows that dazzled millions. But it did not show the bus rides, the hotel rooms shared by 3 men, the unpaid medical bills piling on kitchen tables. It did not show the players crying quietly at night, wondering how they would feed their families once the game no longer needed them. The decade ended much as it began, with unresolved battles, with dignity still out of reach for the majority of players. Yet the fight was far from over. The cracks in the system were now undeniable. The myth of the NFL as a benevolent empire was beginning to fray. The players had tasted resistance, had endured strikes, had seen both the costs and the possibilities. The struggle carried forward, heavier now with the weight of 2 decades of sacrifice. The 1980s were sold as football's glory years. But for the men who lived them, they were years of contradiction, of grinding travel, of endless fights for fairness, of silent suffering hidden beneath roaring crowds. The buses rolled on, the games went on, but the truth traveled with them, a truth that could not be silenced forever. The 1990s arrived with a league unrecognizable to the ghosts of the 1920s. Television, deals worth billions, gleaming new stadiums, and a swelling global audience turned professional football into America's dominant sport. Yet beneath the wealth and spectacle, the echoes of an older game could still be heard, echoes forged on cracked train benches, in cheap hotels, and on fields that never cared about the men who fell upon them. Travel had always been the silent companion of football. In the earliest days, the road itself was a proving ground, mud-choked towns, endless rail lines, and players stumbling from one fight to the next. By the mid-century, the rhythm had changed, but not the demand. Bus rides, cold flights, and itineraries that rarely allowed for recovery. And now, in the 1990s, as the NFL reached its modern heights, the grind of movement still marked the lives of players. The miles were different, the conditions improved, but the cost of human wear that came with constant departure and return remained. Free agency reshaped the landscape in 1993. A hard-won victory for players who had been tethered to teams like property for decades. On paper, it was liberation. The ability to choose a city, a team, a contract that reflected one's worth. But with freedom came upheaval. For every player who secured a record-setting deal, another faced dislocation suitcases packed on short notice, families uprooted, children pulled from schools. Suddenly, careers became a series of addresses, one training facility giving way to another. The game's new economics meant a constant undercurrent of instability, even for men earning millions. What the public saw as glamour, insiders understood as endless motion. Meanwhile, travel itself had become industrialized. Teams flew chartered jets, meals were catered, hotels were first class. Yet comfort could not disguise the relentlessness of the schedule. A season stretched from late summer camps into January, sometimes February, each week punctuated by departure. Sleep rhythms fractured under artificial light. Bodies that demanded routine instead endured constant dislocation. Ask any veteran from that decade, and they will tell you. The airports and anonymous hotel lobbies blurred together, year after year, until all that remains is fatigue. And then came the growing awareness of concussions, a reckoning decades overdue. For years, the league had treated head injuries as inconveniences, another obstacle to overcome on the way to Sunday. Players learned to shrug off the dizziness, the fog, the headaches that followed collisions. But in the 1990s, the evidence mounted. Neurologists spoke of chronic trauma, of a disease that might stalk men long after retirement. Yet still, the expectation remained. Get back on the plane, get to the next city, strap on the helmet again. Travel amplified the problem. A man with a concussed brain, shuttled across time zones and forced into unnatural schedules, found his recovery slowed, his symptoms worsened. Once again, the demands of the road worked against the survival of the body. The tension of the decade lay in its contradictions. The NFL presented itself as modern, polished, global. Players appeared on magazine covers, endorsed products, lived in gated communities. Yet, when the cameras were off, the reality could feel strangely familiar to that of the 1920s journeyman. Then, as now, athletes existed in transit, caught between games, never fully at rest. The bus depots of the past had been replaced by private jets, but the sensation of being endlessly uprooted was the same. It was the old rhythm, dressed in new clothes. Consider the teams based on opposite coasts. A West Coast franchise facing a Monday night game in New England found itself in a cycle of exhaustion, almost identical to its predecessors 70 years earlier. Hours in the air, late arrivals, early practices, and the constant recalibration of body clocks. The spectacle demanded perfection. Primetime television would not wait for tired legs or blurred focus. Coaches barked, fans demanded, networks cashed their checks. The men on the field were expected to adapt, no matter how thin their reserves ran. And yet, players adapted. They created rituals, neck pillows, Walkmans with carefully curated mixtapes, small superstitions about which seat to take on the bus. They learned to read their own limits, to snatch rest in minutes, to harden themselves against the monotony. In this way, they carried forward the lessons of their ancestors. The 1920s had required resilience simply to survive. The 1990s demanded a different kind of resilience, the ability to endure prosperity's hidden costs. But there was another thread running through the decade retirement. For the first time in history, the public began to see what life after football truly looked like. Retired veterans from the 1960s and 70s surfaced with broken bodies, staggering medical bills, and stories of memory loss. Lawsuits began to gather momentum. The league's wealth stood in stark contrast to the poverty of its alumni. Men who had once flown first class now drove beat-up cars to doctors' offices, searching for answers to problems that medicine was only beginning to name. Travel had once promised adventure, opportunity, escape from factory jobs. Now, in the 1990s, it seemed to leave behind only a trail of weary men, still moving from appointment to appointment, still living on the road in another sense. This duality, glory and ruin, prosperity and fatigue, was the essence of the NFL's dark side. The league had mastered spectacle, but it had never solved the human cost. To understand the 1990s is to recognize the strange continuity. How the modern player, boarding a jet bound for Dallas or Miami, carried within him the same exhaustion that once plagued men on rattling Pullman cars. The trappings had changed, but the weight had not. In these years, the NFL also expanded internationally. Games were staged in Mexico City, London, Tokyo. For the league, it was a chance to plant flags across the globe, to declare football not just America's pastime, but an exportable empire. For the players, it meant yet another layer of movement. Overnight flights across oceans, boaties forced to perform at odd hours, routines disrupted in ways no nutritionist or trainer could fully repair. Fans cheered in new languages, but the men on the field felt the toll in the same old ways. Aching knees, blurred concentration, another entry in the long ledger of fatigue. By the close of the decade, one truth was undeniable. The NFL had become unstoppable, a cultural force larger than any individual. But the men who built that empire, who carried its weight across decades, were still flesh and blood. The old images of 1920s athletes stumbling from trains into hostile towns had not vanished. They lingered as shadows, reminders of what the road takes and never returns. The story of travel in football, stretching from the 1920s through the 1990s, is not a story of progress. It is a story of repetition. Better conditions, yes. More money, yes. But the central fact remains unchanged. The game demands motion, and motion extracts a price. A player's career is measured not only in yards gained or touchdowns scored, but in the uncountable miles traveled, the nights lost, the hours stolen by airports, buses, and unfamiliar beds. In this way, the NFL's modern prosperity cannot be separated from its ancient burdens. To look at the league in the 1990s is to see both timelines at once, the dazzling present and the weary past. Every flight out of Los Angeles echoes the train whistle of 1925. Every international showcase recalls the barnstorming tours that once sent battered men into small towns for cash. And every retirement marred by illness or memory loss speaks to the same truth. The road is undefeated. That is where the story pauses on the edge of a new millennium. The league stood triumphant, yet questions lingered about health, about identity, about what happens when the cheering stops. For those who lived it, the 1990s were both culmination and warning. Travel, the great constant of the sport, had brought them here. But it had also left scars that no amount of money or modernity could erase. And so, as the 20th century closed, the NFL remained what it had always been. A game played on borrowed time, carried from city to city, never still, never merciful. The men who shouldered that journey knew the truth. Whether in 1925 or 1995, the field may have been their stage, but the road was their reality. The story of the NFL's dark side is not a story of football alone. It is a story of America itself, how a game born in mud and desperation became a multi-billion-dollar empire. And how the men who carried it on their backs often paid a price that no empire could repay. When I look back on those early decades, I don't see the polished spectacle of Sunday afternoons. I see the exhaustion etched into the faces of players who boarded buses before dawn, who rode across endless stretches of farmland and highway for a chance to play in front of a few hundred spectators. I see men who taped up broken ankles, shouldered the weight of concussions they did not understand. and still walked onto fields where they would earn $25, sometimes less, for their sacrifice. The traveling nightmare was not a side note in their lives. It was the thread that tied together the brutality of the sport with the poverty of its players. Those 20-hour bus rides were more than physical journeys. They were reminders that football, for them, was not yet glory, it was survival. We cannot separate the human cost from the machine that profited from it. Owners in those years operated on razor-thin budgets, but many still lived far more comfortably than the men who brought the game to life. They cut corners on travel, on medical care, on lodging because they could. They knew the players had nowhere else to go, no union to protect them, no leverage to demand better. And so the buses rolled on. I think about what it meant to be a player in that era. To wake up stiff and sore, climb onto a bus where the air smelled of sweat and diesel, and try to sleep with knees pressed into the seat in front of you. To arrive at a small-town stadium, lace up frayed cleats, and hear the crack of helmets without even the protection of a proper face mask. To stumble back onto that same bus at night, nursing bruises and broken ribs, knowing tomorrow would bring another ride. Another game, another paycheck that barely kept food on the table. It is easy, from the distance of time, to romanticize this era as one of grit and purity. And, in some ways, it was. The men who played then loved the game with a devotion that cannot be overstated. But devotion cannot erase exploitation. Passion does not excuse poverty. What they endured was not simply the hardship of pioneer sit, was the consequence of a system that valued their bodies far more than their futures. And yet, without them, there is no NFL. Without those players who endured sleepless nights on buses, who practiced in frozen fields, who played through injuries that would end most careers today, the league does not survive. Their suffering was the foundation. Their sacrifices were the investment. And in the decades that followed, when television money began to pour in, when stadiums swelled with tens of thousands of fans, when Sunday football became an American ritual, the dividends of that investment flowed upward to owners, to networks, to sponsors long before they flowed back down to the men who made it all possible. But the human cost did not vanish with the arrival of money. Even as the game grew, the scars remained. Many of those early players left the sport broken. Their knees gave out before middle age. Their minds faltered under the weight of concussions, never diagnosed, never treated. Their bank accounts emptied long before pensions were established. The game gave them moments of glory, but it took decades of peace from them. I think of men like Joe Guin, who played in the 1920s, and later lived out his years in poverty, his body failing him, his name forgotten by the league he helped build. I think of linemen who worked construction after retiring, shoulders and backs permanently damaged, yet still swinging hammers to provide for their families. Their stories echo in every highlight we watch today. This is not just history, it is inheritance. The modern NFL, with all its pageantry and wealth, was built on the sweat, the pain, and the long bus rides of men who rarely saw more than scraps for their effort. The league's labor battles, its safety reforms, its billion-dollar contracts, all of it sits atop the memory of those 20-hour rides. And so the question lingers, what do we owe them? What does the NFL, what does America owe to the men who endured so much for so little? Some might say the game has repaid them in legacy, that their names, their grit, their pioneering spirit live on in the mythology of football. But mythology does not pay medical bills. Legacy does not fix a broken spine. Pride cannot heal a mind clouded by trauma. The truth is, for too long, the system resisted even acknowledging its debt. It fought unions. It minimized injuries. It dismissed the pain of men whose careers ended before television ever caught their best moments. And only when the pressure became unavoidable did reforms begin to appear: pensions, concussion protocols, travel accommodations. Progress, yes, but always late, always reluctant. When I reflect on this journey, I see a cautionary tale about more than football. I see the story of how industries exploit labor when workers lack power. I see how culture glamorizes sacrifice while ignoring suffering. And I see how the stories we tell, the legends of toughness, stoicism, of playing through pain, can sometimes mask the very injustices we should confront. The NFL of today is a spectacle unmatched in American sports, but its foundation is not simply the Lombardi Trophy or the Super Bowl or the billion-dollar contracts of modern stars. Its foundation is the image of exhausted men stepping off buses in small towns, carrying equipment on their shoulders, bones aching, hearts full of hope that the game they loved might one day love them back. We cannot rewrite their stories, but we can remember them honestly. We can honor not just their toughness, but their vulnerability. Not just their victories, but their suffering. And in doing so, we can hold accountable the structures that turn their passion into profit while leaving so many of them behind. The dark side of the NFL is not just a shadow on the past. It is a mirror. It shows us who we were, who we are, and who we risk becoming if we forget the lessons paid for in blood, in bone, and in endless miles of unforgiving road. So the next time we watch a game, the next time we marvel at the speed and the power and the spectacle, let us also remember the journey that brought us here. Remember the men who endured the buses, the cold, the injuries, the indignities. Remember that the game we celebrate was built by men who gave everything and received almost nothing in return. Their legacy is not just football. Their legacy is a reminder. Progress is never given freely. It is demanded, it is fought for, it is carved out of suffering and sacrifice. And if we forget that, if we let the spectacle blind us to the cost, then we are destined to repeat the same cycle again. The story of the NFL's traveling nightmare is a story of resilience, of exploitation, of triumph and tragedy intertwined. It is a story that belongs not only to football, but to America itself. And as long as we tell it honestly, as long as we carry it forward, those 20-hour rides will not have been endured in vain.